Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. Before we kick off, just a big thank you to UTS Futures Academy for their ongoing support, without which this wouldn't be possible. And the lady you can see on the screen, Julia, in particular. So thank you, Julia. Today we're lucky to be joined by James West. For the past 10 years, James has specialised in applied behavioural economics for a range of industries in the UK, Europe and Middle East. In 2015, he trained with the renowned social psychologist, Robert Cialdini, and even worked at his agency Influence at Work. During that time, James contributed case studies and examples to the New York Times bestselling book, The Small Big. Today, James is going to talk to us about a project that he worked on with Transdev. Transdev is a company that runs the Dublin tram system and public transport in Melbourne and Sydney. They were having issues with customers not paying for their travel and customers not paying for their fines if they were caught. James is going to take it away and take us through the case study.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaron, and welcome to everyone. Thank you all for coming. I hope you get as much out of it as I did from doing the case study. So yeah, as Aaron just said, I worked on this project for about 6 months. Not just me, there was 3 of us mostly involved. All from Robert Cialdini's consultancy, which is called Influence at Work. They have a big consultancy in the US and a smaller one in the UK that covers the UK and Europe. So I worked as an associate for them for about 4 or 5 years. Did a lot of work in finance, a lot of work in transport, some stuff for water companies, and yeah. So yeah, I'll go into a little bit more about my background before we kick off the case study. Here we go. Yeah. So Aaron came up with the wonderful title for this, which is Getting People to Pay Their Fair Share. I'll take you through, like I said, a bit of my background first. So my journey, how I got to behavioural science. So I have a psychology degree anyway. I'm from Rockhampton. I went to Central Queensland University, despite my accent. And in kind of 2006, 2007, I was working on a big project in the NHS in England. And the name of the program was Making Best Use of Beds. I was the head of training. So it was my responsibility to roll out all of these kind of interventions across the entire NHS. And what it was aimed to do was to reduce waiting times in accident and emergency. So no patient, when they walked into the building, should have to wait more than 4 hours to get a bed. Incredibly successful program, some of the best feedback I've ever had in my life on a training program. We led on a lot of big lean things like looking at statistical control charts. We looked at matron-led discharges. We looked at patient pathways through beds. We had some really, really good content in there. So I was very pleased with myself. I went back to my consultancy job and went on to work on the census and other kind of projects as well. But a couple of years after the project finished, I was watching a BBC show called Question Time. And Question Time has politicians on, and members of the public can come along and they can speak and they can talk and ask questions to the politicians. And this particular one, I was sitting there with my flatmate at the time, and Tony Blair was on. And it was just before his final election result. And a nurse in the audience stood up and she said, that waiting times in accident emergency project. She said, you know what people are doing? She said, they're sending patients out of the building and making them check in again so they don't miss the target. She said, they're putting people on trolleys and they're calling it beds and ticking them off, etc. And I was quite shocked. In fairness, Tony Blair was also quite shocked because that's not what we taught them. They could have used the tools and techniques to actually improve waiting times in accident emergency quite substantially. And it just shocked me, and I wondered why people I knew were good people. I don't know a lot of nurses who go into nursing so that they can be cruel to their patients. I just wondered why they would do that. What was it about the situation? What was it about what was happening that would make a bunch of kind of nurses do that? And so I started to read all of the psychology. I started to look at the literature, started to look back on how that happened. And then as my career progressed, I was eventually the director of transformation for TV licensing in the UK, which is the agency that collects money to fund the BBC. And I knew that some of the things they were doing weren't psychologically right. They were doing bad social proof messages, etc. I didn't quite know how to fix it. I didn't quite know what to do. So I literally just rang up Influence at Work, Robert Cialdini's consultancy. I'd read his book. I knew who he was. I knew who Steve Martin was. And I said to them, it's like, look, guys, I know we're doing some stuff wrong here. I know there's some things we can do with this persuasion literature. So why don't you come and do some work for me? So we did some nice little reciprocity campaigns. We did a thing. I learned quite a lot. And then about a year after that, I'd kind of had enough of Capita. I was talking to the influence guys, and they said, well, come and do some work for us if you're going to leave. And I was fortunate enough to go and train with Robert Giordini. So I went to Arizona for 2 weeks, did his Principles of Persuasion course, eventually became a trainer for his Principles of Persuasion course, and then ran training courses and consultancy, mostly in the UK, but occasionally in Europe as well. So I don't know if you can just a little show of hands if you want to tell me if you know or have read the Influence book. Can I see? So I might ask you some questions about what you might do in the situation later, but any show of hands there? I will say while I'm waiting for somebody to chat, there's a new book came out about a year ago. There's some extra information in it. There's a whole new chapter on unity, etc. So if you haven't read it for a while, it might be worth revisiting and having a look again. The other thing I'll say, no, I'll wait. I'll say that a bit later.
James, it's easier if people type. So we've got a couple of people. Anne has said, yes, she's read Influence, Arizona represent, and Jimmy as well.
I'll have some questions later, and you can type into the chat what you might do. And if I describe a situation, tell me which principle you might use, just to get a bit of activity going. It's a bit weird for me talking for half an hour without any kind of interaction. So anyway, so that's a little bit about my background and how I got there. And my fascination is always with the kind of, why do people do what they do? If you ask them, they won't tell you they'll do that. But then when you go and watch what people do and how they behave, they tend to behave in a very different way to how they expect themselves to behave, and also how I expect them to behave as well, including myself. I'm not immune. Okay, so the best advice I ever had about doing applied behavioral economics or behavioral science was from Robert Giordini. And he said something like this to me. He said, there's always influence happening in the situation. So if you examine the situation enough, if you find out what that influence that's already happening there is, find it and then dial it up, amplify it. What you should never, ever do when you're doing case studies or when you're doing work with people is try and force behavioral techniques in there that don't actually belong in that situation. So as we go through, I want you to kind of bear this in mind, because that's what we're trying to do with this case study, is look at what's already there in the situation. We already know certain facts about how people are behaving, who buys tickets, who doesn't, etc. And so those principles, those persuasion principles that Robert Cialdini talks about, will naturally emerge from that situation. And then what you have to do is figure out how to use them, how to amplify them, how to make them, communicate them to everybody or to the whole target group. So like I said, just bear that in mind as we go through. It's about finding what's in the situation, not about all your knowledge and all the books you've read and the techniques you know. It's about what's already there for you to use. So let's talk a little bit about the actual case study itself. So the LUAS is the train system. It's one of 3 major transportation systems in Dublin. So you have the LUAS, which is basically like the trams in Melbourne or the tube in London, etc. It's kind of short-term, commuter focused, etc. You have the DART, which will take you a little bit further out, and to some of the outlying villages of Dublin, like Howth and places like that. And then finally, you have the bus system as well. So they're the 3 main parts of transportation. The LUAS is one of the busiest of those. There are 2 lines that are red and green lines, 67 stations across the centre of Dublin, about 115,000 daily passengers, and carries about 48 million people per year across the entire network. So that's kind of a little bit about it, about the background. It's all overground, so it's not an underground system. It's more like trams. So what was the challenge? So what was the problem they were having? So the Dublin LUAS system is actually run by a French company called Transdev. So they're a large company. They're involved in transportation networks all over the world. For a while, I don't know if they still do, but they used to run Sydney, and I think they ran the trams in Melbourne for some time as well. And the problem they were having is that they were getting large fines. So because they weren't hitting their targets, Dublin Transport were fining them. And actually, the entire program, the entire outsourcing model that they were using was losing money because the fines were so substantial, because people weren't paying for their fees, or they were appealing them, or in some ways just not paying quite a lot of the time. And we'll talk about why that was as we go through. So like I said, it's ungated, so it's not like the London Underground or even in Brisbane, where you have to use the card to open the barriers. So anyone could just walk on and walk off anytime. So the SFN, the standard fare notices, only about 21% of the fines that were issued were actually being paid, which is very, very low rate of payment. There are various reasons for that. People would give false names. People just wouldn't pay. People would have it in the appeal system and it would take months and months and months, and eventually it would just get frozen and forgotten about. So lots of reasons why it wasn't being paid. There are a high level of appeals. So I think 30%, is that what it says there? I need to move the thing. Yeah, so about 30% of all of the tickets that were issued would go into the appeals process. And there's again some reasons why people were appealing that we could change and change the default to make sure that it became less likely. Customers are giving us false names. The ticket inspectors are very visible. So we went out and sat on the tubes ourselves and sat there in the commuter traffic, etc. And you could literally see when you saw a ticket inspector walk down the length of a train and people just wouldn't get on the train. They'd wait for the next one. So you could see like a whole mass of people moving and then some of them just stop, not do anything, wait for the next train and jump on. So the fact that the ticket inspectors were so visible, everyone knew where they were and you could see them on the trains because they were quite short, meant that most people, or a lot of people who hadn't paid for a ticket just didn't get on that train. So a bit more background. There were 49 ticket inspectors across all of those 67 stations. They operated in random shifts, mostly obviously during the commuter hours, but there were people there during the day as well. It cost €45 for a penalty. So the standard fare notice was 45. And one interesting fact about this, I mentioned the DART and the buses. Not buying a ticket on the DART and the bus was actually a €100 fine. So actually it was much, much lower, the fines, than it was for other transportation networks in Dublin itself, which is important later on in the story. Very few evaders were actually prosecuted. Like I said, they would go to appeals. If they lost their appeal, they might or might not pay, but a lot of appeals just got lost in the system. Part of the reason for that is because there's only half a day assigned by the courts to dealing with it. So it could take up to 6 months to a year for anything to come to court, and quite often it wasn't worth the effort. Had a very informational communication strategy. So we'll talk a bit about what we might do later. But yeah, it was very much about, you will be fined if you don't buy a ticket, please buy a ticket, et cetera, et cetera. So very informational rather than behavioural. So in terms of data gathering, here's what we did for this. We did 2,000 short customer surveys. So it was very easy to get people while they're waiting for a tube just to fill in a 4 or 5 questionnaire. So we hired 5 or 6 psychology master's degrees and PhD students from the local universities, and we paid them for a week to just go out and get these customer surveys done. So interviewing commuters as they were getting on the train, and it asked questions like, the main question or the main thing we got from it was, what do you call somebody who doesn't pay for a ticket? What's the name you would give to that behavior? And we'll talk about what we did with the answers to that a little bit later on. We did structured interviews with all the inspectors. Obviously, they'd seen every excuse under the sun. They'd seen what people do. They've seen all the behaviors, etc. So we did structured interviews with all of the inspectors. Observation, like I said, we actually went out and sat on the trains, looked at the experience ourselves, noticed what people were doing, people not getting on trains, etc. And then also we reviewed all of the processes. So we looked at the appeals process, we looked at the standard fare notice, and we looked at the letters that were being sent out as reminders for payment. So in terms of data gathering, it's mostly qualitative. Obviously, we did have some quantitative stuff in terms of how many people travel, how many people don't have tickets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the new strategy that we pitched to Transdev and to the Dublin LUAS. So a new comms campaign, so looking at how we're going to reframe evasion. So let's talk about what it actually is, which is what came out of our survey, which was the people who don't pay for their ticket are cheaters. They're cheating the system, they're cheating the honest people who are actually paying for their tickets. We need to redesign the appeals process. It was far, far too easy to appeal. And we actually, as a company, made it very, very simple for people to fill out the system and to actually appeal. We gave them, for instance, we gave them free post envelopes so they could send their appeal in for free, which, again, if you're getting a free post envelope and a pre-completed form, you're more likely to do that behavior. We need to define the SFN process, so how standard fare notices were handed out. So a script for the inspectors, and also, the actual form itself. So how can we make the form, use behavioral psychology to make the form more effective at getting people to be honest when they filled it in and getting people to pay their fines as soon as possible. Sorry, and then, yeah, finally, standard fare form as well. And like I said, there was a reminder letter that went out after 7 days to all of the customers who'd been issued a fare that month. And so we had to redesign those reminder letters again to be more persuasive, to get people to pay the fine. So section 1, let's have a look at the comms strategy. So this is what the posters looked like when we arrived at the LUAS. So as I said before, very informational, just tells you that you may be taken to court, you can be fined, you could be evicted. I don't think anyone had been convicted in the year before we turned up, so I don't know how accurate that is as a message. Again, inspectors are being made by revenue officers in uniform and plain clothes. As far as I know, there were no actual plain clothes revenue officers. They all wore uniforms. They were all very easy to pick out. The final poster was some kind of strange Christmas campaign they did. I never quite figured out what they were trying to do. I think it was because you had to pay your €45 fine, you couldn't get your girlfriend a present for Christmas. I think that's what they were doing there, but I'm not 100% sure. So this is the kind of stuff that was in the, on the platforms and on the trains before we arrived. So just from what I've told you before, does anyone have, so if you were designing this poster campaign, just think about this Cialdini's 6 principles, think about the kind of things that he does. What can you see in the situation already that would help you? So we've talked a little bit about, we had 2,000 customer contact places. We had little questionnaires that we'd given them. We know how many people travel on the trains, etc. We know how many people don't buy tickets. So if you just want to quickly put in your chat, what does this all indicate to you? What's happening in the environment here that we could use to help us to make people more honest, to get them to pay their fare? Any thoughts? So 6 principles: authority, commitment, social proof. I've got to remember them now. I've gone blank.
Got a comment from Anne.
Excellent. Yeah.
Emphasize how many people do pay their fares.
Absolutely. And which one is that? Does anyone know? Which one of the 6 main principles of Cialdini's is that? Yay. Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, social proof. So what you've actually got here is a situation where actually most people are doing the honest thing. So, even though fare evasion was a huge problem for Transdev, across the entire system, it wasn't a huge problem. Because most people were honest. And that's what came out of our surveys. And what actually came out of our surveys was So what actually came out is there's this binary thing between people who are honest and pay for their ticket and people who don't pay for their ticket. And what everyone told us is what we should call them is cheaters. They're people who are cheating the system. So this idea of cheaters became a really kind of powerful way to try and convince them to do something different with their poster campaign. And as you can imagine, Dublin Transport Authority were very, very, very reluctant to go calling some of their customers cheaters, but it was the language that they used. It was how they spoke to each other, etc. I'm going to show you the campaign that we designed around the posters. But first of all, just a little bit of quick social psychology for you. So this is one of Robert Cialdini's really famous experiments. It was done at the Holiday Inn chain in Arizona, and he was trying to get people to recycle their towels during this day. So I don't know if it's in Influence. It's definitely one of the other books. But these were the actual the actual door hangers that they used to do the experiment. I have a friend who runs the replication lab at Lancaster University in the UK, and he just replicated this experiment and got very similar results, which made me very happy. You can see there's a standard environmental appeal, which is, please help the environment by recycling your towels. We have what's called a many others social proof message, which is 75% of people who stayed in this hotel recycled their towels. So lots of other people who are staying in this hotel recycled their towels. And then everybody's favorite social proof message, the many similar others. So not just many others, many other people like you. And in this case, which I think is kind of weird, it actually said 75% of the guests who stayed in this room, and then it actually had handwritten in the room that you were actually staying in. So it's a very kind of like other people who stayed in this room recycled their towels, which when you think about it is kind of weird, because when you go to a hotel room, you don't really want to be thinking about the other people who've been staying in the hotel room. That's just very odd. What happened though when he did the experiment? So 35% of people recycled their towel at least once during their stay. And the many others condition, about 46% of people. So we got a quite nice 11% increase there. And then finally, when you say that other people who have stayed in your room, so if you localize it, if you make it much more context bound, then you get an even bigger increase, so 54%. And some of you will have seen the very famous tax study that the nudge unit in the UK did, which had a very similar thing. 75% of people in Northampton pay their taxes on time. So using this and using this idea of social proof, we designed a new campaign to help people to pay their taxes. So it's going back there, there's that emotional thing about, are you honest or are you a cheater? And this is one of the posters that we did. So Transport for Ireland wouldn't let us actually mention the number. We wanted to say, 80% of people pay their tax on time, etc. But actually, they would let us do this. And in some ways, I think that's probably a nicer infographic. So you can see there, you've got all of the people who do pay. They're the honest people. And you are not one of those people. You are alone. You are not an honest person. You are a cheater. Who wants people who are cheating the system and cheating out all of the honest passengers who get on the train. Here's another one. I just put this in there to highlight it. So thank you to all of our LUAS customers. The vast majority are paying the fare. Again, singling out people who are not one of those majority. Bring your behavior in line with what the social norm is. And in this particular case, this is what I wanted to highlight to you. We actually did this by the busiest stations on the Dublin network. So it's to our Tallaght customers. So that's one of the stops where lots of people get on. So it's back to the idea of many similar others, people who come to your stop every day, people who come here, get the train to work like you, etc. Most of them are paying their fare. You're not. You're the odd one out. You're the one who has a problem. And just as a kind of coda to that, so I said earlier that the Sydney transport system is also run by Transdev. So we did this, I think, in 2016. And then in 2017, they took some of the stuff that we've been doing there and did their own versions of it. So you will see, based on the LUAS campaign, if you live in Sydney, and I think Melbourne may have, I'm sure Steve Martin went to Melbourne and did something for Transdev over there as well. So you may see it there as well. So this is just one from the Sydney thing. So you can see they've combined the two things. So they're allowed to use a number, 9 out of 10 customers pay their fare. And then, that they put the thank you thing in there as well to our honest customers. I do have if anyone has an answer to this, I'd be very curious in the Q&A. So there was much debate amongst all of the consultants who are working on this project about whether we should actually be saying thank you for something that people should do. So in the end, we kind of went with, thank you to our honest customers. But there were a couple of people who really dissented from that idea that, we shouldn't be thanking people for something they should do anyway. If they're getting the tube, they should be paying. Or if they're getting the train, they should be paying. So if anyone knows any research on that or has any kind of thoughts or ideas, I'd love to know, because I've never quite sorted out in my mind whether we should be thanking people. At least in this case, we're thanking them for the right behavior, which is the honest behavior. But yeah, anyway, like I said, I've never quite figured out in my mind if that's as effective as some people think it is. Okay, I will say as well, I think that of all of the things I'm going to show you tonight, this is probably the thing that was least effective. I mean, it's great having a social proof message, but a lot of the time when I speak to customers or when I work on projects, this is kind of what they think that social psychology does, or this is what they think behavioral economists do. But I would say that the stuff we did afterwards, the redesign of forms, the redesign of the appeals processes, etc., is probably even more effective at reducing fare evasion than just these campaigns. But it's not quite as, I don't know, interesting or sexy. So, when you're doing social proof message, everyone goes, oh, wow, that's great. But actually, some of those little things that we do, like I said, form redesign, making things easy to understand, putting it in customers' language, etc. I think actually they're probably much, much more powerful, changing those defaults than the whole social proof kind of campaign was. But we didn't break it down by that, but that's just my own opinion. So let's talk about the appeals process. So when we talked to the client, they said that this is what the appeals process looks like. They said, what will happen is, people will either pay their fare and they'll have no problems at all, or they'll pay the £45 fine. So that's what they thought was happening. They didn't realize that they had 30% of people appealing. They didn't realize how many people weren't paying, etc., because they'd never really sat down and looked at their data. But when we went out and interviewed people, this is what we discovered. Everybody assumed that you could appeal and you wouldn't pay. Even people who were honest, who were paying, just assumed that everyone else was getting away with it. So in people's minds, it's like, why would I bother paying when I can just appeal it, or I can give a false name, etc. Even the people who were being honest tended to think that this is how the system worked. So they thought we either pay nothing and get on the train, or we can just appeal it and we'll never have to pay, never have to give the money. So there's a complete difference between what we found in our qualitative research compared to how the customer was actually seeing. And like I said, that didn't matter whether people were paying or not. Everybody assumed that nobody had to pay, that you could just appeal and get away with it. So that was what was in their mind. That's what it really looked like to the customers. So some of the things we did with the appeals process. So on the form, the standard fare notice that was handed out, and I'll show you a copy of that later, it used to actually say you can appeal this decision, you can, here's the number to write to, et cetera, et cetera. So we just took that off the form. So, don't give customers the idea that they can appeal. If they want to go and look at the website and find out how they can appeal, then they can do that. But why telegraph it to them in the first place? I'm sorry, and during the issue of it, so we told the inspectors not to say anything as well. So when the inspectors came out, we said, don't tell them they can appeal it, just give them the fine and tell them they can pay it immediately or they can pay it online. So we moved the appeal from the front page of the website into the terms and conditions. So the biggest button on the front home page of the website was for appeals. So it was the first thing that your eye was drawn to when you looked at the website. And so we moved that into like the other category. So it was just in there with all of the other jumble of things that people don't really look at. And actually, believe it or not, paying the fine was not on the front page at all. So the first thing you saw when you got onto the website, there was nothing at all to say you should pay your fine now online. It was all just you can appeal, you can do whatever, etc. And as I said earlier, they actually gave them a free post envelope that they could use to actually appeal against their fare notice. So we took that away, but we did give them a free post thing if they wanted to pay. So we gave them a free post letter for payment, but not one for appeals. And also on the website, we changed it so that you could only appeal if you downloaded the thing from the web, and it had to be returned in a PDF format. So I guess that's what people call sludge now. We introduced some sludge into the appeals process so that we could actually slow them down and make them think, oh, I can't be bothered. I may as well just pay my fine. So this is what it looks like now. So this is how the website looks at the moment. And you can see there in the darker colored pen, it has pay your standard fare notice. That used to say appeals. So before we changed the website, that used to say appeals. There was nothing on that front page to say that you should pay. That was under the more button that you can see on the far end. So we just moved the pay standard fare to there and told them to put the appeals thing into the more thing. So if people wanted to appeal, they had to actually hunt around and find the way to appeal. So we're making it just a little bit harder for them to do the appeals. Okay, so that's appeals. Right, the standard fare notice. So believe it or not, there was no way to pay immediately. So there was nothing on there to say, you can go online now and pay there. You could pay in cash to the ticket inspector, etc. There was nothing on the actual form that actually said, you can pay us now and forget about it for the rest of the day. Don't do it again, etc. We designed a script for the ticket inspectors. So I said earlier there was some issues around people giving false names. I had a friend who used to work in London, and he took the tram and he didn't pay a ticket. He would say he was Alfie Langer and walk off. So there's a lot of people doing that, just giving false names, giving false addresses, and just wandering off. So one of the things we put in the script is for the inspector to introduce themselves by name first. So my name's James. What's your name? So immediately you've got that kind of commitment thing of they've already given you, if you give them your name, a little reciprocity thing, then they will give you their name immediately back. And then suddenly they're trapped in this kind of commitment cycle where they have to be more honest in how they fill in the form. We did a few things like that. We asked them to point out the cameras there for crime, et cetera, et cetera. So a new script for the inspectors, that they weren't undermining their own position and that they were making sure that it was more likely that people would fill in the form honestly. Move the pay button, said about that. We sent the letters out earlier. So usually the reminder letter went out 14 days after the initial fare notice, and we moved that back to 7 days. Okay, we also introduced this. We tried to introduce fining them €100, because that's what the DART does, and that's what the buses do. And they were very, very resistant to that idea. So we did the kind of classic kind of parking thing. Well, if you don't pay after 14 days, then it will go up to 100. So it's 45 now if you pay now, but up to 100 if you don't pay within the first 14 days. So this is what it looked like before. You can see all the appeals, appeal, da, 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 da. So we redesigned the system to make it much more simple, moved everything forward, made sure that the final letter was sent out earlier. We rewrote that letter, I'll get to that in a minute, et cetera, et cetera. So just like streamlined the whole process so it was simpler, easier, and made it easy for the customer to pay and harder for them to appeal or to not pay. So this is what the standard fare notice looked like before. I have no idea why you needed such a big note section. No one really used it, but we redesigned it to look like this. So just a couple of things to point out. So number one, we took Transdev off the form because nobody knows who Transdev is. They don't know, that they run the actual tube, etc. As far as they know, it's all transport for Ireland. And also we put the Garda symbol on. So the Garda in Ireland are the police. So we made it into a much more stronger form just by adding in, this is what the police, this is the police, this is an actual legal document. You could, go to prison. You could be fined up to $1,000 under the Railway Safety Act, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually put that in. I understand that providing a false name and address to the authorized person is punishable by a fine up to $1,000 euros. I understand that this constitutes a legal document. Please tick here. So a little bit of commitment. So tick here to say that I have done everything correctly. We also put a little picture of the camera there. So a little thing to say, you are being watched. People are seeing this interaction, what's happening. Now the cameras aren't actually there to pick up on fare evasion. They're there to prevent crime and much worse things than fare evasion. So they wouldn't let us actually mention the fact that we would use it in court or whatever, but they did allow us to put the images are recorded and the crime prevention and then put the little picture there. So these are kind of just little hints at authority messages. This is a legal document. This is a serious thing. You can go to court for this, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also gave them forms that they could fill in if they wanted to appeal to say why they hadn't purchased a ticket. And my colleague, those boxes at the bottom there, queue for the ticket machine too long, leap card failed, et cetera, et cetera. He took them directly out of the Transport Act from 2005, and they're actually all reasons why that won't be used as an excuse in court. So it's actually, all of those things are not eligible to get you off paying your fare in court. So, as I said, after 7 days, a reminder letter went out, 14 days, and they would have to pay 100 euros rather than that. So we redesigned that letter as well. So beforehand, it had been very chatty. It had been very kind of like, oh, you haven't paid, da, da, da. So we made it into a much more serious and authoritative document. We actually listed out all of the severity orders, so almost like a contrast effect thing. So we actually put onto the document, you could pay €1,000 plus court costs, or you can pay €100 after 40 days or 45 after the thing. So we actually put them in declining order to make sure that people understood the severity of what could happen to them if they didn't pay the standard fare notice. We actually put the phrase cheating onto the document itself. Again, huge fight with the client for that, but also it tied into the poster campaign that we'd already run. And then we highlighted the path to purchase, made it easy for them. They can tear it off and just take the smaller part away. And we actually put a map of the courthouse on the back of the appeals letter. So on the back, it had, here's where the court is. This is where you will have to go if you don't pay this fine within 14 days. We also tried to put, this is the nearest LUAS stop to the courthouse as well, but the client wouldn't let us keep that on there. We thought it would be amusing, but yeah, but they let us put the map of the courthouse on. So we just took a Google map. This is where the courthouse is, stuck it on the back of the form. And we introduced a countdown. So this is how many days remain until people get summoned. And this is what the new form looks like. So you can see there at the start in red, we've got the social proof message. The vast majority of people who use the LUAS system traveled with a valid ticket. And on this day, you were not one of those people. You can see there, we've got current bylaws allow for fines up to 1,000 for failure to produce a ticket. then the standard fare notice is 100. But if you pay on this time, then it'll be 45, etc. The easiest way to do this is online. So we made it simple for them to go on and pay immediately. And yeah, so the tear off form that they could just take away, get to work and just instantly fill in. So that's kind of a close up of the language that we put onto it. Okay, so we talked about reframing all the options. So it's now $1,000 is the €1,000 is the highest one, then 100, then 45, etc. Okay. So I guess now we're all waiting for what were the results. So what they did is they compared for 3 months from the 2015, the same months in 2015 to the same months in 2016, assuming that everything kind of, passenger numbers would be similar, et cetera, et cetera. So the drop in fare, we had a 17% drop in people not paying for their tickets. The fines paid went from 20, I said 21% of the SFNs had been paid, and that went up to 75%. And then finally, we reduced appeals down from 30% of all standard fare notices that were being issued, got that down to around 11% of people who were appealing. So I'm not sure what the time is. I can't see on my thing. Okay. So I think we've got, that's the full case study from me, but we've got 15, 20 minutes to take some questions. So if I have a quick look in the Q&A, is that the easiest way to do it?
Yeah, it is. Just before you do, I've got a question for you, and then I'll start queuing them up. So when we talk about behavioural change, here there's obviously a couple of different components. There's the customer itself, but what were the main barriers to behavioural change you found with your client, and also maybe with ticket officers? So in Sydney, I can see that ticket officers are pretty loath to go and approach someone and dish out a fine. They seem to say, it's not my job.
So the client was tricky. One of the things I forgot to mention in the appeals process, which again, just human behavior is quite fascinating, is that every single appeal had to be read by 2 senior members of staff at the LUAS. And they used to get together and have like a little afternoon of looking at appeals together and stuff. It was like a little fun activity for them. So there was no kind of motivation for them to kind of reduce appeals, even though it was costing them a lot of money, etc. There was no real motivation. And then you had the disconnect between how Transdev saw the world and how they saw, what was happening on the LUAS compared to the actual people in the offices, etc. In terms of the ticket inspectors, they were quite used to walking up to people and finding them. They're not kind of ticket inspectors who sit in a booth. They're actually on the trains the whole time, and they're kind of walking around getting people's tickets, and they're just quite used to handing out fines. So it wasn't a huge problem to convince them. We did ask them at one point to, when they were doing the honesty thing on the form, to kind of, indicate to the cameras, but they were a bit reluctant to do that. But most of the other things, like introducing themselves by name first, and then getting the person to tell them their name back, and things like that, they were quite happy to do that. So yeah, so I think most of the problem was in that kind of the tranche of middle managers. The fact that we couldn't get them to do €100 fine compared to, which is what was happening on the darts and happening on the thing, that was a big battle that had to be fought. And then the cheaters thing, I genuinely understand why people don't want to go calling their customers cheaters. I do get that. So yeah, so I have less issues with them arguing about that. But that's what people call them. That's what. And I think, it goes back to that similarity thing. If you're using the language of your customers, if you're saying what they say, then that's going to be much more powerful than if you're using your own language. So I've got another example of this that I use all the time, which is I used to work for AOB Bank in Ireland as a behavioural economist, and we had the arrears department. I was writing letters for the arrears department, and I did a little Google Analytics search and said, and the #1 typed question in Ireland was, "What is arrears?" So people were getting these letters and they didn't know what arrears meant. So they had no idea what the letter was telling them. And because they were the arrears team, they just kept writing this word, throughout the entire document. So we just went and looked at some online money forums and, people who were struggling with finance, etc. And the word everyone used is arrangements. Is the bank going to come to an arrangement with us? Will they make an arrangement with us? If I've got this problem, will they make an arrangement with us? So we just changed all the letters to say, if you ring us, we'll come to an arrangement with you. And we got like a 20% increase in people phoning us with those letters compared to saying, what is arrears? So again, it's about that granular kind of, getting the customer language, getting the feeling, observing what they do, how they behave, etc., and then putting that into your communications. So.
That's a great example. All right, over to some questions. All right, we've got Jackie. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. If people have a valid reason to appeal, it should be a simple, straightforward process for them to navigate. How did you balance that with the desired need to not overly encourage people to appeal by making it too easy?
We didn't stop them appealing. We did just make it harder for them to do. If you have a genuine reason and you're willing to, click 3 extra buttons to find it on the website and to then to go in and fill in the form, then, that's perfectly fine with me. What I think we were doing is making it far too easy for people who didn't have a valid reason to do it. And I would prefer to err in that direction of making it, more difficult for dishonest people to do it who don't have good reasons than to make it easy for everyone. So, but I can see why other people might differ on that. But like I said, we didn't change the process. We just made it harder for them to use it. So we didn't reduce options. We just made the options behind a separate screen, and we made them do it in a PDF in a downloadable form rather than give them the form on the train. So we probably saved some paper as well. So.
And can you just give a bit more context to your question, and then I'll come back to it? Just type in the chat because it's to a specific slide you were talking about, James. So we'll come back to that.
Okay, I'm in the chat.
No. I'll read it out for you if that's easier. But Lloyd has a question. Is there any backfire from poster re 9 out of 10 pay their fare, suggesting if you don't pay 10% of the time, it is within normal?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I don't think people read it like that. I think, the idea I've always had when I do social proof messages is that not that they don't pay 1 out of 10 times. They just know that everybody else is paying. But yeah, it's curious. I hadn't really thought about it. So, but I'm genuinely sure that people aren't sitting there thinking, okay, if 9 out of 10 people aren't paying, I'm going to pay, I'm not going to pay the 9th time or the 10th time or whatever. Is that what the question's getting at? Am I misunderstanding it perhaps?
No. I think Lloyd's saying, hey, are we actually creating a social norm that there is 10% of people aren't paying? So does that create a norm and actually encourage that behavior? No,
it doesn't. If it was the other way around, if we had 60% of people who weren't paying the fare and we said that, then we'd be doing exactly that. It's a boomerang effect. So that's what was happening at TV licensing when I was there, and I knew was wrong. They were saying, this person on your street hasn't paid their TV license with a big pointy finger. And that's actually doing that. That's saying, oh, that guy's not paying his TV license. Why should I? But if you actually change that message to, everyone on your street apart from one person is paying the fine or paying their TV license, then actually that's the correct social proof message. And the worst example I saw of this was in Manchester. There was a children's charity. And they did this poster campaign across all the bus stops in Manchester. And it literally had the message, 70% of teenage boys who drink alcohol also have unprotected sex. So they basically just signal to every single teenage boy in Manchester that their peers are, drinking and having sex. It's like, and that is a really bad social proof message. That's what you don't want to do. And if you can't use social proof in a situation because everyone's doing the wrong thing, then just do something else. Don't try and force it.
We'll get a question from Johan van der Nest. Maybe I missed this point, but what were the main barriers for people not paying their fares?
Yeah, it's curious, actually. I think they just thought they could get away with it. And they have been getting away with it for a long time, And like I said, when we interviewed people, we did the 2000 case studies, it became very clear that nobody thought that anyone paid a fine. So everyone just kind of thought, well, it doesn't really matter. I'll just get away with it. I don't have to pay my €2.10. So they might give me 45 things, or I can just give a false name. And everyone has, friends who've done it, or, have maybe forgotten their wallet once and just jumped on the train or whatever. So then, everybody was thinking that everyone else can get away with it. And that's what we had to change, is that idea that, no, you're not going to get away with it. There's courts, there's, an increasing in, from 45 to 100. And, we're telling you exactly how to pay it and when and how. And we're making it hard for you to do anything different. So.
I think you said that you didn't break down the effectiveness between the different channels that you looked at?
No, it was all just one big campaign. So
yeah, it's a shame because I think you're right about the appeal redesign and the form process. And yeah, I'd love to see that breakdown. But
yeah, so would I. But no clients will ever pay for that kind of thing, unfortunately. So, and before I got into the behavioural economic side of it, I told you that story about the NHS. A lot of my consultancy was like lean and process improvement and stuff. So I think there's a huge kind of overlap between those two things. Because a lot of this stuff is just lean. It's taking away non-value added waste. It's kind of looking at what adds value, what doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there should be a lot more kind of lean behavioral economics, kind of looking at how we design better systems and better processes. Being more customer friendly and getting rid of all of that, trimming a lot of other stuff out. So.
Yeah, 100%. Ross has a question for you. Starts off with a compliment. So thank you, Ross. Thanks, James. It's been really interesting to hear about. Keen to hear your view on the line between influencing behavior versus manipulating behavior.
How long have you got? I don't know. There's a standard response, which is as long as you're not taking away people's choices, or you're not reducing the overall choice set, then you're not really doing anything that's unethical. I kind of believe that, but I can see situations where it might not be. I think like the organ donation one is a bit strange, I think, in some ways. Should we be opting people in without them? So I know that some places are now doing forced choice options, so you have to choose yes or no rather than just default in. So yeah, and I think that one of the reasons I really like that thing I said at the start is if you find the influence that's in the situation, then you won't come across it because it's already there, it's already happening. So, we knew from the social proof campaign that it would be fine. There wouldn't be anything unethical about it because it was true. Most people do pay their fare. We're just giving them information. We're just taking that information that we already know exists, and we're taking the influence and we're just scaling it up. And we're not saying, it's subtle. It's not kind of saying, you will do this, or you will be conscripted, or, you will go to jail. In fact, in some ways, it's a bit nicer, the social proof campaign, than the ones before, which were actually quite threatening and saying, you will go to jail, you could be fined, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I don't know. I think you just have to, it depends on the client. It depends on what you're trying to do. Yeah, I don't have an easy answer to that. I don't think so. Apart from that thing I said about find what's already there. Don't try and force things in. Don't try and force authority messages in where they don't belong. Don't try and force in, similarity messages where they don't belong. Just find what's already there. Look at the data. Go out and observe. Talk to people, and it will be there. Something is always there. You just have to find it. So.
That question in mind, and not being controversial, but there was one slide where you showed there were some boxes with reasons for fare evasion, but then you explained that those were reasons that wouldn't stack up in court. Was that a redesign, and do you think that influenced behavior instead of just having open-ended, what was your reason? Would that have changed?
It's a good question, and the reason we put it in was because the client demanded it. I don't think we wanted to. And so we thought, well, why give them reasons that they can go to court and say, well, it was this, well, it was this, etc. Why would we want to help them to get away with not paying? So let's just put in all the reasons why, that won't be accepted in court. So I think that's the reason we did it. But yeah, I can see why that might be a bit.
But yeah, interesting that the client wanted that in it.
Yeah, I don't. Again, like they liked appeals. The appeals weren't just for the customer. The client actually enjoyed doing appeals as well. But and it was overwhelming the courts as well. So they had half a day per week. I think it was Monday afternoon set aside just for appeals from the transport system. And so, like I said, it could take 6 months to a year and a half to get through that. So it was, it was a burden on not just Transdev, it was a burden on the courts, it was a burden on everyone. So, again, if you think about it more systemically, it makes sense to do it like that as well. So.
Yep. Got a question from Anne. So, Anne, just go back to me in the chat, if you will, about that previous question. I want to know the context for the specific number. And I think that may have been around why wouldn't they let you call out how many people? But Anne has a question. Embarrassed to be advertised my ignorance, but can you run down the difference between behavioral economics and behavioral psychology? I don't think that's an ignorant question at all, then. No,
so I think so my answer to that is well, I've got a friend who's an economist, and he always answers that question with so economists all believe that incentives are what drive human behavior. but they think that all of those incentives are monetary in some way. So, and then psychologists came along and said, no, you're right, incentives do drive a lot of behavior, but actually there's a lot of other things that incentivize people that aren't just money. And I think that's kind of a really nice way to think about it is, the economists were onto something. They weren't wrong. People do react to monetary incentives. They do, they do react to incentives. It's just they weren't thinking about what are some of those other things that people react to. So I think the psychologists have that kind of toolkit of, we respond to relationships, we respond to what our friends are doing, respond to what other people are doing, respond to what people we love are doing. We respond to what authority figures tell us, etc. They're all just types of incentives. So it's a kind of behavioral economics is kind of the merging of those two kind of fields, I think. So, and Daniel Kahneman being the famous one, his decision making and judgment stuff, and then winning a Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's a psychologist, is kind of, I think, what revolutionized the field. From a personal perspective, I call myself a behavioral economist. There are two reasons. One, because more people know what a behavioral economist is than a behavioral psychologist. And secondly, it's actually illegal to declare yourself a psychologist unless you're a member of the Australian. I only discovered this a few months ago. But yeah, you can't call yourself a psychologist unless you are a paid up member of the Australian Psychological Association or whatever it is. And there are some pretty, like 40 grand fine or something if you're caught calling yourself a psychologist and you're not. So I tend to stick to behavioral economics, even though my background is psychology rather than economics.
Didn't know that.
Like I said, a therapist friend told me a couple of weeks ago. I was like, what? Really? She sent me the passage as well. I was a bit surprised. I'll forward it over to you.
Yeah, please. Got a question from Paul. Paul says, were you dealing with a small group cheating frequently or most people cheating occasionally? No,
the first one. It was definitely the first one. There's a hardcore of people who just don't do it. And there will always be a hardcore of people who aren't going to pay. No amount of social proof is going to change that. So you're looking at there's going to be, let's just say, I don't know, I can't remember what the numbers were, but let's just say 20% of people weren't paying once or twice a week. Of that group, 5 or 6% are never going to pay. They're just people who won't. They prefer to lie. They prefer not to pay. They're antisocial in some way. So what you're really working with is that 15% of people who will. So it's those people who kind of, have forgotten or they're in a rush or whatever, etc. So you're trying to get to those people who are in that category of, oh, I know I should, but, for various reasons I haven't. So that's the kind of people you're kind of aiming at. And I think, and I've seen this before as well in my career, people get hung up on that kind of like really hardcore refusers. And so they try and aim all their communications at the people most difficult to persuade. It's like, no, just ignore them. There's nothing you can do. Concentrate on, find that other group, those other people who aren't like that. So we had the same at TV licensing. So we had people who just refused to pay the BBC license. They would lie and say they didn't have a TV. They just, just absolutely and utterly refused to pay. We had other groups like students. So they were in halls of residence. They were hard to get to. We had people who just moved home and didn't update us on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we just ignored those hard refusers. We had field agents who went out to, try and deal with them, et cetera. So we just kind of ignored them. We didn't do any comms for them. We didn't talk to them. We just concentrated on the other groups. How are we going to persuade these people that it's important to get a TV license? This is what they should do, et cetera. So I think, again, just, don't worry too much about the really hardcore refusers. It's just that middle tranche you have to aim for, I think.
And did you business case that? Because, I think there are people that have worked out, hey, look, if I avoid paying fare X amount of days, and then I get a fine, I still come out on top, and the chances are da 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 da. So they're hardcore refusers. But when you were working with the client, did you go, look, there's 20% of people that aren't going to do it, and then from that we're going to go for 10%. If we can shift them, it'll hopefully lift revenue?
No, we didn't break it down like that. That's what marketing people love to do. They love to invent personas and to do all that. And we didn't have they didn't have a marketing team there, or not one for the LUAS. So, but yeah, no, I've seen marketing people do exactly that, where they'll kind of like, that's what we did at TVL. They broke it down into like personas and different things. But we didn't do anything like that for LUAS.
So you've spotted my background. Got a question from David. We might take one or two more. Charlotte, I'll put it in the LinkedIn group, Sydney Behavioural Economics Network. It usually takes me about 3 or 4 days to get the video and get it in. So probably early next week. David's got a question. Have you found any relation in demographic aspect, like age, gender, education, nationality, etc., in your customer survey?
We didn't ask in this survey because, we were trying to hit people with a 1-minute survey while they were waiting for a train. So we didn't ask any demographic questions. We just asked them about, how do you find the experience on the LUAS? What would you tell people about it? What would you call people who don't pay for their ticket. What do you call people who do pay for their ticket? That's where we got the honest cheater thing from. So it was just 4 or 5 questions, and we didn't go into any demographics just because we didn't have time. We had time to do lots of them, but not time to do very many in depth with customers. So, but yeah, I suspect there is. I suspect that, for instance, more men would not pay for a ticket than women. That would be, I think, a fairly logical deduction. So I imagine there are some demographic things there, but we didn't look into it at all. So. On the nationality thing, I have to say, not just the LUAS, but lots of places make it very difficult for foreigners to buy tickets. I get confused sometimes if I'm in Sydney where I have to go and what I have to do, and I kind of think a lot of signage could be a lot better for people who are visiting or tourists or whatever. I think we're very bad at that kind of just general signposting and big arrows saying buy your ticket here. I think there's some really simple things we can do to make it easier on platforms and stuff for people to know what to do, especially foreigners. So.
I think that comes back to your observation before, where behavioral science and customer experience are going to go hand in hand and start to help each other a bit more, I think.
I think definitely, yeah. Rory Sutherland has a great little TED talk about the new Heathrow Airport, where you follow the signs for trains, and then it suddenly goes underground and it's a different color and it goes the other way. It's kind of like, not helpful at all. So he's got a couple of amusing examples like that, but he's absolutely right. So.
He's always got an example. That's why we love him.
Indeed.
James, I think we'll wrap it up there. That was awesome. Thank you for taking us through such a detailed case study. Right. I love how it wasn't just the comms. Hey, look, this is the messaging, the ad campaign we went out with, and this did everything. It was about that systematic review of all the processes and putting behavioral change along the way as well. So I think that was fantastic.
Can I just pick up on this question before we go, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course. Which one?
About the hiding information, the appeals thing again, about hiding the information. And like I said, I do really understand where the question comes from. But when you've got that front end screen, you've only got a certain amount of real estate. And I don't think the appeals process, it's not like we're hiding it. Something has to go in the other section. There's lots of other things in there as well. I just think that the paying your fare is a more important thing to have on that front screen than the appeals processes. If they wanted to move it around so that appeals could go there, but they didn't want to do that, they could have had it both on the home screen. So although it says, hiding the information, I'm not sure it was hiding it. It was just putting it, putting the more salient information, the things you wanted people to know, which is pay your fare up front. And then, like I said, we didn't get rid of it. We didn't say you can't appeal or anything. We just stuck it behind the more button. And all of those screens are going to have real estate, and you're going to have to make decisions about what to put on them. So I guess it's the priority of the organization and what they're looking to do, really. So you're constrained by the environment of the web page, I think is what I'm trying to say. So, and deciding what's important with that real estate. So.
I think that makes sense, because your point was basically the appeals process was too easy. We're giving people page forms that they could fill out and send back, so you make it really easy. And you go to the website, instead of showing people how you pay, it was here's how you appeal straight off the bat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can type appeals into the thing and it will come up. Like I said, we weren't taking the option away. We were just putting it one extra click away. So.
Awesome. And, no, thank you again, James.
Absolutely, you're very welcome. Brilliant. Thank you for inviting me. It's been very kind of you, and I've enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Good. And yeah, we'll definitely tell you about the next face-to-face, and when we
please
sort
do.
that, maybe
Christmas
November, December.
Great, yeah.
Get you up.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for the questions. That was great.
Yeah, great discussion.
Thanks for coming along.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, James.